Hello, I'm Jeanine Nodder, and on this episode of Chattin' with Jeanine, I have a former U.S. Marshal in the studio today. He's the author of the book, No One Has to Die. It's about the Waco that wasn't. So please welcome Steve Monier. Welcome.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Yeah. I almost called you by your son's name because I know him.
You know my son Chad as well. Yeah, that's right.
So I'm really excited to talk with you today, and I can't wait to read your book.
Well, thank you.
So the book is about the Brown standoff.
It is. It's about the Edna Lane Brown standoff, which occurred in Plainfield, New Hampshire in 2007. And it was during my tenure as a U.S. Marshal here in New Hampshire. Unfortunately, it was the longest armed standoff in the history of the U.S. Marshal Service, which is saying a lot because the U.S. Marshals are the oldest federal law enforcement agency. They were stood up in 1789 by the first Congress, and the first 13 U.S. Marshals were sworn in by President George Washington, including the one here in New Hampshire, a man named John Parker.
Now, how did you get to be a marshal?
So the marshals in each district in the United States, like the U.S. attorneys in every district, are appointed by the president and must be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So it's a political appointment. The deputy U.S. Marshals, on the other hand, who are the backbone of the U.S. Marshal Service, they are career federal civil servants, much like FBI agents and DEA agents. But the U.S. Marshal for each district is appointed by the president.
So you were a Goffstown police officer for a number of years?
I was. I served 30 years with the Goffstown Police Department, the last 15 of which I was the chief of police in Goffstown.
And who was the president when you were appointed marshal?
George W. Bush appointed me after I retired. I retired from the Goffstown PD in 1999, and George W. Bush was elected in 2000. He appointed me, and I was confirmed by the Senate in May of 2002. There was a bit of a time lapse there because I went down to D.C. for an interview 3 weeks before 9/11 happened. So as you might imagine, the government was very occupied after following 9/11. So.
Yes. Now, I first met you when at a 5K, actually, a road race.
That's
you
right.
were with then Senator Kelly Ayotte, who's now our governor.
Yeah.
And I was introduced to you, and I just came out my mouth. I said, "Thank you for not shooting the Browns."
Well,
I don't know if you remember that.
I do remember meeting you there, and I went to work after I got done as a U.S. Marshal, of course, with a new administration. Obama kept me on for a year until my appointment was confirmed by the Senate. So I served until November of 2009. So almost 8 years, 7.5 years as a Marshal. But I had gotten to know then Attorney General Kelly Ayotte during this standoff, in fact, and we worked together on a couple of other joint federal state projects, law enforcement projects. And after I got done as Marshal and she got elected to the Senate, she convinced me not to retire and to go to work for her, which I did for 6 years following that.
Wow. This edition of the Union Leader came out on September 28th, 29th. And what's her name? Shawn Wickman?
Yes.
She did a wonderful job, wonderful write-up about you and your book. There was a lot of information in here, and I kept it. You can tell it's old now. So the Browns didn't pay their taxes.
So,
and go ahead, tell us that story.
So starting in, we actually first got involved with the Browns in 2006 because in 1996 they stopped paying their federal income taxes. Edna Lane Brown lived in Plainfield. Dr. Brown was a dentist with a very successful, thriving practice in an office building that they owned in West Lebanon, New Hampshire, right next door to Plainfield. But they stopped paying their federal income taxes because they bought into this belief that's out there. I call them tax deniers, who believe that you do not have to pay your federal income taxes on ordinary income. which is not true, by the way. So the IRS tried working with them. Usually it's a civil process to begin with. They say, look, you're not paying your taxes, you owe us back taxes, penalties and entrance, let's work out something. They didn't. So they ended up being indicted by a federal grand jury in 2006. The IRS Criminal Division came to us, the Marshal Service. They had worked with us on another tax denier case that went well. No one died. And they said, we have this warrant. Would you care to serve it for us? And I guess maybe looking back, I could have said no, but my chief deputy and I, we said yes, we'll help you out serving this warrant. We didn't want to go to their house because they owned 110 acres in Plainfield, New Hampshire, on a remote section of Plainfield.
Yeah, that's their house.
But this is the house, and it sits on a hilltop. And as you can see, there's a almost a 3.5-story turret attached to this very odd-looking house. And the Browns, because he was also head of the U.S. Constitution Rangers, a militia group, wherever they went, they were always armed. And we knew. He was well known, Ed Brown, about his beliefs against the federal government. We didn't want to go to his house because they were heavily armed, and we didn't want a confrontation there. So we actually conducted the first of 2 ruses in 2006 to lure them both away from their home, and we made the arrests at the commercial building, West Lebanon, at her dental office. I had Deputy U.S. Marshals there that were dressed as public works and waterworks people, jeans, fluorescent vests, hard hats, and we had the Lebanon dispatch call them and say there was a water problem at the commercial building. That's how we lured them away from the house to safely arrest them. Ed showed up first. We took him into custody, and then Elaine showed up second and took her into custody.
Now, this was how long after Ruby Ridge in Waco?
So not long after. So, Ruby Ridge occurred before the Waco conflagration in Waco, Texas. Ruby Ridge was in Idaho. And again, here was the gentleman involved in that. It was a tragic situation. A deputy U.S. Marshal and a Marine Corps veteran was killed in an exchange of gunfire trying to serve an arrest warrant on him for failure to appear. About a year later, Waco took place. And so this was not long after Ruby Ridge and Waco. It was still fresh in the minds of people. In fact, what happened then, after they were arraigned in the federal court, the judge let them go on conditions that they show up for their trial, they turn over all their weapons, and there were many, to the marshals and to the U.S. Probation Office. And so we accompanied them back to Plainfield, gathered up the weapons that Ed told us where they were and what he had, although we didn't believe we got all of them.
Yeah, he had more.
He had more. And they went to trial in January of 2007. They showed up for all their pretrial proceedings, showed up for the beginning of the trial, and they failed to appear on the last day of trial of that week, January 12th,
and that's when they holed up in their house.
Correct.
Now, they didn't leave their house until the day they went for the water the pipe that broke at their office?
So that first ruse was in 2006. That was the arrest following the indictment.
Oh, okay.
So then they were let go at arraignment, even though the prosecutor at the time argued that Ed should be detained because he was head of the U.S. Constitution militia group. They were anti-federal government. He had espoused all sorts of anti-government things, saying that the federal government had no authority over him. Sovereign citizen kind of talk. You have no authority over, didn't respect federal law enforcement, didn't recognize their authority. So the prosecutor asked that he be detained until trial, but the judge let both of them go on conditions.
Mm-hmm. How did they get food? I mean, they were...
So during the standoff, which started on January 12th...
A siege.
Siege. Yeah, armed standoff. It wasn't a siege because we didn't lay siege to the property. That was part of our strategy to have this end without anybody getting hurt. But He could live off the grid. They had a windmill on the property. They had solar panels. They had generators. They had stockpiled food for years. They had an underground bunker beneath the kitchen.
Wow.
Where they also had 10 to, well, when we arrested them, they had 40,000 rounds of ammunition, all sorts of weapons.
And IEDs around the property as well?
They were inviting people, militia supporters. This was the first federal case of this sort where the wanted people used the World Wide Web to their advantage. So they were encouraging people from around the country to support them. In fact, many were traveling from around the country to visit the Browns. We didn't shut that down because Ed Brown, who liked to talk, was giving radio interviews, he and Elaine, from their home during this standoff almost every day.
And so you knew everything they were doing.
So we were listening. We got a lot of criticism for not shutting that down, but we were listening to them, and Ed was telling us almost everything that was going on at the home and who was there almost every day. So we were using that. The other thing we were using the internet for and monitoring all of their communications was we observed early on that they were prepared for the men in black, you know, in the Lanco armored personnel carriers to drive up the driveway or come through the woods, our SWAT team. But they were letting other people they didn't even know just drive up the driveway, including members of the media. During this standoff, which lasted almost 9 months, he would give regular interviews with local, regional, national news authorities.
When people left the house, did you stop them to make sure they weren't smuggling out?
The other thing we were doing, we had electronic and human surveillance of the property, but we didn't lay siege to it. We weren't preventing people from going there because we recognized early on that that was their Achilles heel. They were letting people drive up the driveway. So my chief deputy and I said to each other, you know how we can do this? Let's drive up the driveway.
Yeah.
It took us a long time to get there because we introduced an undercover operative to the Browns through somebody else who was communicating with them from Illinois, who had visited them several times. He introduced the undercover operative to the Browns in September of 2007, finally 9 months later. And that's the way we were then able to bring in a team of undercover deputies from our Atlanta task force. These guys were very brave that went in there. In fact, if this were a movie and you called up Central Casting and you said, send me some good old boys from Georgia, that's who went in a pickup truck to the Browns. But they were undercover deputies.
Wow. And it was the longest armed standoff in the history of the U.S. Marshal. I think you said that at the beginning of the show. I was just
almost 9 months. 266 long, sleepless nights worrying about what might happen. Our fear was because they were threatening from the very beginning that they hold up there. They were threatening that if anybody comes there to arrest them, it's going to be another Waco or Ruby Ridge. And of course, we know what happened in Waco.
Right.
75 people, including children, ended up dying.
Yes, and then Timothy McVeigh went and blew up the federal building.
As a year later, after Waco, Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirator blew up the federal mural building in Oklahoma City.
And I remember that. There was, 19 children were among the 168 people that were killed.
Yes.
And there was a picture of the fireman carrying out a baby.
I know.
A baby that had been
tragic.
killed. And I'll never forget what that looked like.
And the Browns, both Ed and Elaine were constantly talking about this and threatening this. Initially, they threatened the judge, the prosecutor, the U.S. attorney, me, and other law enforcement officers. But we ended up having to put 24/7 security details on the judge, on the prosecutor, and the U.S. attorney. So we were cycling deputy U.S. Marshals from around the country during this process in and out of the district to assist with that, because it takes a lot of people to run a 24/7 protective detail on a protectee.
And must have been so stressful.
And it was very stressful time, but the good news is that, and they were contributors to the book, My chief deputy was a guy named Gary DiMartino, and the regional chief inspector was a guy named David Dimmitt, who ended up pretty much living in New Hampshire for those 9 months and helping us with this. We had a good leadership team. From the very beginning, we said, we don't want Plainfield to join the lexicon of Ruby Ridge and Waco. We want this to end the right way, and the right way was not a shot being fired and nobody getting hurt.
Gerhardt,
Yes.
I think it was Jason Gerhardt?
Yes, Jason Gerhardt.
And he was there, and
so there were, these people were coming in and out of there, but we identified 4 principal individuals who were doing the most to obstruct justice and to aid and abet them in their obstruction of justice. And they were bringing them weapons. They were bringing them bomb-making materials. When we finally arrested them and did a sweep of the property, and we knew this because of the intelligence we had, that we found over 200 IEDs on the property. Mostly pipe bombs, but also tripwires and a wood line around, bags of tannerite, which is a binary explosive hanging in trees that he could shoot so they'd explode. So again, they were prepared for the special operations group to go in, but they were letting people drive up the driveway.
So Gerhardt was one of them, and he ended up going to jail. How old was he?
He was 19 at the time. He was from New York.
Well, he doesn't look any
City.
older. He was a state representative, and we didn't know.
So when he finally got out of federal
so
prison, those 4 were prosecuted. They did time. Gerhardt was one of them, and for whatever reason, he decided he wanted to come back after he got out of prison and live in New Hampshire. So, in fact, he lives not too far from where my chief deputy lives. And then he ran
for sheriff.
Well, he ran first for state rep.
State rep, and he won.
And he won.
He won.
And then following that, he ran for sheriff up there and was defeated, fortunately, in the primary.
Yeah.
But yeah, true believer in terms of this stuff about, tax denial, the limits of federal authority. But he's here. He's out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he hasn't aged. I've never talked to him about any of this, just about different bills.
Yeah.
And I would never know who he was if it hadn't been pointed out. Like, that was the one that went to jail because he was part of that. I'm like, wow.
Yeah, he was bringing them weapons.
Yeah.
And bomb-making materials. So that's what he was prosecuted on.
So you were part of another book as well, in the Lindbergh baby.
Yes.
I've read. I wonder if I read it. I have read a book, at least one, about the Lindbergh baby kidnapping.
So I'm a bit of a very amateur historian, but I like history.
Love history.
And
me too.
When I was still chief of police in Goffstown, a good friend of mine who's a criminal defense attorney out of Manchester named Greg Algren, he's also an amateur historian, and we got interested in the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, which happened in 1932. And so he and I decided to write a book about it together because, of course, you may know that the state of New Jersey executed Bruno Richard Hauptmann, for the kidnapping and death of the firstborn son of Anne and Lindbergh, Anne Lindbergh, and their baby. And that was a case in 1932. So we wrote a book about that called Crime of the Century. Our theory was that Hauptmann didn't do it, but that actually Lindbergh was involved in the negligent death of his child. And
really? Okay, then I have not read the book, because I read a different book.
Yeah, it was...
they said that the book that I read, whoever it was, bragged about killing the baby and said they did. And there were also people that would show up at their door saying, I'm your son.
Right.
They didn't really kill me, I'm your son.
Right.
I mean, what a cruel thing to do.
Yeah,
but,
that did happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh was probably the most famous, in 1932, most famous man in the world, of course, because he was the first to fly solo across the Atlantic in the Spirit of St. Louis. So, but he was also a very strange duck. So.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, now I have to read that book too, okay. Crime of the Century. And that was the last century. The new crime of the century was O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson, yeah, also called the crime of the century. So, but this was a case that this is the inside story of what went on. We couldn't say a lot during the armed standoff, even though this was big news almost every day in the Union Leader and the Concord Monitor and the local paper up in the Upper Valley region, Connecticut Valley region, but also CNN. So there was widespread coverage on this. So there was a lot of pressure on us to end this more quickly. But our strategy was that we wanted to do it so that no one got hurt. And the last thing we wanted to do, obviously, if we had gone there with a SOG team and they started shooting at us, well, guess what? We'd have to shoot back, and people would die.
Yeah.
And that's the last thing we wanted to have happen. We wanted this to end the right way. So,
and thank God it did.
My chief deputy had a strategy early on, and I like to call it. I call it in the book the oldest trick in the book. It's called the Trojan horse, and that's essentially what we did. We brought in a team of undercover deputies and
Georgia
boys from our Atlanta task force. And the Browns thought they were like-minded supporters, militia from Georgia coming up to support them in their standoff with the federal government.
And they were, I think I read it in the article, that they were eating pizza and just having casual conversation. And that's
they made the arrest on the front porch of the Browns' home about 7:45 at night while they were eating pizza and drinking a beer.
See, and I'm like, where'd they get the pizza?
So you'll have to read the book, of course, and I would encourage your viewers to read the book. It's called No One Has to Die, Inside the Longest Armed Standoff in the History of the U.S. Marshals. So.
Do you have any other books in the works?
So I've written 2 nonfiction books, and it's kind of a straightforward telling of true events. I am thinking of trying my hand at a series of fictional books loosely based on some other U.S. Marshal Service cases over the years.
Oh,
so,
that'll be interesting.
But I've never done that, so I've never written fiction. But I would like to try that.
And this book, I believe, is written in the third person?
It's written in the third person, yes. In fact, the Sunday News reporter, Sean, asked me about that. She said, why didn't you write this in the first person? I said, because I'd have to write I all the time. And I said, I wanted this to come across and emphasize this was a team effort. I had a great team here in the District of New Hampshire, and with support from our headquarters in Washington, D.C.
And there's no I in team.
And there's no I in team. I said, I couldn't write it that way. So that's why I wrote it in the third person. So. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it, and I know my friend Maureen Mooney has a copy of the book,
yes.
so we can compare notes. And I don't know where she's at in the book, but I'm going to try and beat her.
Well, you know, one thing I would tell you, if you, it's available on Amazon, my book.
Is that okay to say that? I don't. All right.
Is that okay?
We're not allowed to do call to action, but
okay.
You know,
but it's
wherever books are sold.
Wherever books are sold, and also the publisher. You can go to the publisher's website. But
it's
I just
Genius Books.
My publisher is also doing it as a podcast. So I just finished reading the book into the program he sent me. So it'll be available as an audiobook, really.
My husband listens to audiobooks. It's like,
a lot
every
of people
night
do.
He's like, listens to books and has his cigar at night.
I have people that commute, have hour commutes, and they say, can I get it as an audiobook? And well, now it'll be available as a podcast. And you may recognize the narrator, because I read the book to this program my publisher sent me, which in hindsight, the average book's about 80,000 words. So this one's about 110,000 words. It took me a week to read all the chapters into this program.
Oh, wow. So if somebody was going to listen, I've never listened to an audio book. I listened to podcasts.
So when I say a week, it was, I didn't do it all day long. I could only talk for like an hour and a half at a time with breaks, reading it in, and I had to be careful that, when you narrate a book, so.
Yeah, what happened? How do you do that? If you stumble over words, like I stumbled over my words earlier in this
Fortunately,
episode.
they can edit things. I had to buy, he actually sent me a studio quality microphone that people do podcasts with, and then he sent me this program where I read it in from my home office. So.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah. It was a fun endeavor. But my next book will be shorter if he wants me to do that again.
Yeah, the series. Yeah, I had an author on the show several years ago. He was a police officer here in Merrimack.
Oh.
And he was also a police officer in Nashua before that.
Okay.
And he wrote a couple of books about all these different stories. I think it was nonfiction, though. It was actual cases that he worked on.
Yeah.
Including a homicide of 2 girls in Merrimack. So you may have heard of him, Detective Horak. He actually took me to Candia, and we walked through the woods so I could see where they found the bodies.
Okay.
And then I looked them up. I went to the library and looked up, I think it was microfiche, to find the stories, the articles that came out in 1973 about that.
73.
Yeah, about that homicide. It was interesting.
Yeah. Those are tough cases. So. Fortunately, we only handled in Goffstown 1 homicide during my tenure. So.
Yeah. Well, one of his chapters was about getting sprayed by a polecat. Yeah.
I've been sprayed by skunks doing
early
days doing rounds checking businesses on the midnight shift. So yeah.
Well, I used to run marathons, and I'd get up before dawn to go running, and I didn't worry about getting hit by a car. I got worried about getting hit by a skunk.
Yeah. They wander around very early in the morning. Yes.
Well, thankfully, I never got caught, and I enjoyed chatting with you today. And thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching.